Hi. Is there anything better than a juicy hamburger? I don't think so. I'm Colleen Miner. I'm a professional cook, and I'm going to tell you all about meat. The different kinds, the different cuts, how to cook it, and so much more. You're not going to believe it. But first of all, we have to find out what we mean when we say meat. We actually mean either beef or veal that comes from cattle, or lamb that comes from sheep, or pork that comes from hogs. Okay, that's all we mean. We don't actually mean poultry. That's a different category altogether. Let's look at what all meat has in common. 4 things in common, and we can tell when we look at this steak. It actually has muscle, and that's the part we like to eat mostly, and connective tissue. That's this line here that holds the muscles together. That's why we call it connective tissue. It has bone, and it also has fat, and we can see the visible fat around the sides, but all these little lines running through it are also interior fat. Now, meat is an excellent source of protein and iron and vitamin B. But when we choose meat, we should try to choose meat that's lean, and when we eat it, the proper serving is about 4 ounces, and that, by the way, is the size of a deck of cards or a small fist. I think my fist is a little bit too big. When the butcher gets the meat, it comes in wholesale cuts. Then he divides it into what we see, retail cuts. Some of the wholesale cuts are chuck, ribs, short loins, flanks, sirloins, rounds. And then when we come to the supermarket, we look for them all packaged and in retail cuts. Now, when you go shopping, the best information you can have is either from the butcher or right from the label. It will tell you what kind of meat you're getting. This one says fresh lamb. It'll tell you the wholesale cut. It's from the leg. It will tell you the retail cut, sirloin chops. It also tells you a great deal about, for instance, how much weight you're getting, what the unit price is, and what you're going to actually pay. It also tells you the use-by date. That's when you should use the meat by or when you should freeze the meat by. And now they're even including instructions on how to cook the meat, how to handle the meat, and the safest way to use it. So it tells you a great deal. Now, when we go to the grocery store, we really want to get the best for our money. And here's some of the ways we can do it. If we buy a pound of meat, like hamburger, we want to buy about 4 ounces per person. And when it's cooked, that will be a 3-ounce serving, which is a good serving of meat. However, if we choose chops with a little bit of bone and a little more visible fat, 1 pound will actually serve only 3 people. And if you were to buy ribs, for instance, that have a lot of fat and a lot of bone, a pound will only serve about 1 or 2 people. There's one more thing you need to know about meat. When you buy it, it comes in 3 different grades. Prime, that's you're usually going to get from a butcher shop. Choice, which has a little bit less fat and costs less than prime. And Select, which has the least amount of fat and is really the least expensive. Now, to get the most for your money, you can choose Select, which is usually a tougher cut of meat, which has to be cooked longer. Or you can take some meat and add vegetables or pasta to it, which are less expensive. And then when you get it home, what you really need to do is store it. So you want to buy it at the grocery store, come home as soon as possible, not leaving it in the car, and keep it in its original package. When you're ready to put it in the refrigerator, put it on a plate, something to catch any drippings that might be there so it doesn't contaminate it. Now you want to use this within 2 or 3 days of purchase. And if you can't, you can freeze it. Okay, I'm going to store my meat so it stays nice and fresh, and then we're going to cook it. Now we purchased our meat and it's time to cook it. You know, since caveman developed fire, we've been cooking meat. But how we're going to cook that meat, whether we're going to roast it or braise it or stir fry it or microwave it, depends on the cut of meat we're talking about. The first thing you have to know is whether you have a tender cut of meat or a tough cut of meat. We're going to start with the tender cuts. This is a roast. A roast is a large, tender cut of meat. A ham is really a kind of a roast. This is a pork loin roast, but you can have a veal roast, you can have a beef roast. They're all cooked the same way. You put it in a shallow pan, usually on a rack, and then you season it. We're going to season this very simply with just some salt and a little bit of pepper. Well, actually, a lot of pepper. My family likes pepper. Now, one of the things you should notice is we're not going to put any extra liquids in this pan because this is a tender cut of meat, because it has some fat running through it. And by the way, always put the fat side up when you put it into a pan. We don't need any extra liquids. Now, we're going to put it into a 325-degree oven. And we're going to cook it until the internal temperature reads 160 for medium or 170 for well done. How are we going to figure that out, you ask? Well, the best way to figure it out is with what we call a meat thermometer. This will give you the internal temperature of meat. And it actually goes into the roast all the way in before we put it in the oven. There's another way to tell, and that's with an instant read thermometer. This is a very handy thing to have in the kitchen. Now, how you use the instant read thermometer is you put your roast in and then you check it. And when it's cooking, you look at it and it will tell you, and you take it out. And keep doing that. Most recipes will tell you that there's about 20 minutes for every pound of meat. So if this is a 4-pound roast, 20 minutes, 4 pounds, you figure it out. I'm going to put this in the oven. Well, we've talked about a tender cut of meat. Now let's talk about how to cook a tough cut of meat, perhaps a chuck roast. We're going to braise it. Now, maybe that's a term you haven't heard very much about, but it's very simple. It's almost like stewing. What we do is we take our meat and we brown it on both sides, and we put it in this is called a Dutch oven. Any kind of pan that's high-sided will do, because what we're going to do is we're going to add liquid to it. About 1.5 cups of beef stock or chicken stock or even water to cover it. Then we're going to put a cover on it and we're going to cook it for a very long time. Cooking for a long time tenderizes meat. So this gets cooked for about 3 hours. You can either cook it on the stove on low heat, or you can put it into the oven at 325. Now, after you've cooked it for about 1.5 hours, a wonderful thing to do is add vegetables to it, and you have a whole meal. Well, we're going to cook some tender cuts of meat, but now is a good time to talk about food safety. Remember, always wash your hands thoroughly with soap before you start working with your meat. And I like to use a paper towel so it doesn't contaminate other things. And before I cut anything, I want to mention my cutting board. I use this cutting board only for meat. I'm not going to cut anything else on it until I've washed it in the dishwasher or by hand with soapy hot water. Okay, so now let's talk about cooking a tender cut of meat. We're going to broil or grill. Okay, what's the difference between those two things? Well, broiling is usually done in an oven with the heat at the top and the meat about 3 or 4 inches from that heat. Grilling is usually done outside with the heat coming from the bottom, and again, about 3 or 4 inches. Either way, you're cooking tender cuts of not very thick meat, and you're cooking it dry with no added moisture. Okay, now I have on my grill pan here, this is a broiling pan, I have a steak. Notice it's about an inch thick. I don't want it any thicker than that. I've got about a ½ inch chop, and I have some pork tenderloins that I've marinated. These can all go under the broiler or on a grill. But let me talk a little bit about marinating, since I've marinated my pork tenderloin. Marinades are liquid that tenderizes and flavors meat. There's lots of different combinations. Usually cookbooks have a whole list of different marinades, but they usually contain an acid, which is what actually tenderizes the meat, and a flavoring that gives it a little extra flavor. We're going to do a Chinese pork tenderloin. This is my favorite marinade because it's so simple. It has 1/3 cup of soy sauce, that's my flavor. It has 1/3 cup of brown sugar, also flavoring, and it has about, let me measure this, a tablespoon of lemon juice, and that's my acid, which really tenderizes the meat. Now we take our pork tenderloin and we put it in the marinade. Now this can go in for about an hour. Put it in the refrigerator. Don't let it sit out on your counter until all the flavors are together. You know, you don't have to make your own marinade. You can go to the store and they have lots of marinades in the aisle that do the same thing as a homemade does. Okay? By the way, did you notice that I'm marinating in a heavy-duty plastic bag? This is just a great way to get all the liquid around the meat, one of my favorite. And that way you don't have to worry about it dripping in the refrigerator. Now we're going to pretend that this has been marinating for about an hour. And we're just going to put this meat on a skewer. And then put it on our broiling pan. Put it under the broiler. This is going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to cook, and we're going to turn it once. And yet another way to cook a tender cut of meat is pan frying. You're probably most familiar with this. That's how we cook the hamburger. That's how we're going to cook the chop. And sometimes it's called stir frying. Now the Chinese are said to have invented stir frying, and the tool they use is the wok. This pan right here. You can tell I love to stir fry because this is a well-used wok. But you don't need a special pan like this. You can stir fry right in your own little frying pan. Let me just turn it on. We're going to stir fry a tender cut of beef that I've cut into small pieces. The principle of stir frying is really small pieces of meat cooked very quickly. So to do that, we have to heat the pan first, put just a little bit of oil in it. Helps if you take the cap off first.